Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to East Georgia State College's commemoration of Constitution Day. This is a yearly event that we sponsor for our campus community and for our larger group of friends and supporters. And we welcome you, and especially want to welcome you on behalf of the political science program, Dr. Chiazzo, Professor Mullins, Dr. Carlos Cunha, Professor Dan Mansell, and myself. My name is Lee Cheek. And we are honored to have you. We also want to thank the people who have allowed us and helped us put this on as an event. Caitlin Moore, Harley Smith, and Mike Roundtree, thank you for your help. And we're going to begin. This is an event that is scheduled for an hour, and we will keep that time frame. And there are a number of options that one can use for participating. This is also being streamed on YouTube, and we'll have an opportunity to ask questions. You can ask questions via the chat function if you would like. And we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, let me welcome you on behalf of East Georgia State College. And let me take a moment and introduce our guest speaker. Our guest speaker, Dr. Roger Byrd, who is Associate Professor of Social Sciences and Director of Prison Programs at Brewton-Parker College in Mount Vernon, Georgia. Roger is a native of Jeff Davis County, which is actually in the service area of East Georgia State College. Roger went to undergraduate school at Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College in Tifton. He then completed his bachelor's degree in political science at Brewton-Parker College. Roger is a distinguished public servant, having served for 22 years in the Georgia State Legislature and being a leader, at some points being what's called a floor leader, and in other capacities. Roger was one of the people who helped write Georgia's most recent state constitution. So if there are any problems in Georgia, blame Roger. No, just kidding. But we celebrate Roger's role in creating that very important document for the life of Georgia and Georgians. Roger also completed graduate studies, doctoral studies at Valdosta State, and has very recently published an important book entitled Sisyphus No More, The Case for Prison Education. We are honored to have Dr. Roger Byrd as our Constitution Day speaker in 2021. And we want to welcome him to our campus, welcome him to this event. And Roger's book has been nominated for the Best Book Award, the American Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, and it's going to be the subject of a panel book discussion at the annual meeting of the Georgia Political Science Association in November. I am most proud that Roger is my student who has gone on and excelled beyond me and others to do great work and have a great influence and continuing good labors on the behalf of the study of political science and the study of public policy and public policy in action. So allow me to introduce Dr. Roger Byrd.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cheek. It's a privilege to be here, a pleasure too. I was indeed Dr. Cheek's student, actually an advisee of his, and I still remember the day I approached him about my dream of becoming a college instructor, and he, rather than discouraging me, he encouraged me and actually helped me along the way. I wouldn't be teaching at any level, especially at college, if it were not for Dr. Cheek. And I'm a big fan of his and his writing, but not nearly as much as my wife is. My wife is his biggest fan, and she was. I'm sure she'll be viewing this lecture, not to hear my words, but to hear Lee's introduction probably. So anyway, it's very good to be here. This is a very important event that we celebrate at many institutions, and it's something that has actually been placed into law and in regulation. It's so important so that we do reflect on the Constitution annually. We do infuse that with civil participation, encouragement, and I was listening to there's great debate going on. Hopefully, a new piece of legislation being formulated in the U.S. Senate, excuse me, that will incorporate civil participation as a part of one of its major components. So I'm hoping to see that come to be. But at any rate, it's very important that we recognize the Constitution, that we reflect on it as often as we can, because as has been said, it is our foundational document, so to speak, and there's great misunderstanding and a lot of missed cues as far as what it does and doesn't do. Let me begin by saying this, in my view of the Constitution, and everybody has a perspective on the Constitution, and they're certainly not all the same, and that's one of the things that makes our republic such a great place. We all have differing opinions, and when done correctly, we can resolve those differences amicably. But it's my contention, my view of the Constitution, that it is a living document. I don't believe, some people do, that the Constitution, as it was written and chiseled into marble, never to be changed and updated. The best argument for my position is the fact that we have amended it 27 times already. And that's not many amendments. As Dr. Sheik mentioned, the state constitution, it's the one that I helped to craft in 1982, actually has been amended hundreds of times. But the U.S. Constitution has been amended sparingly, but it has been amended. And that is testimony to the fact that things change. If you think about the Constitution, when it was originally passed or ratified by the states, it did things such as it did not speak against slavery, so to speak. It allowed for slavery. It did not allow women the vote. And there are many things originally in the Constitution, and the original Constitution didn't include the Bill of Rights. That was added very quickly, but the enshrinement of the civil liberties that we know in the Constitution today wasn't there. So we amended it to do things like enshrine the civil liberties, ban slavery, give women the franchise, the right to vote, and all of those things along the way. So we change it as is necessary. It's a difficult process, and rightly so, but we can change it. It does change from time to time. I find it interesting that that it's an imperfect document made by imperfect people. One evidence of that is that we banned alcohol. And then shortly, a few years later, we passed another amendment to reallow it. I think that's just evidence that we're imperfect people trying to find, some path, the proper path. So we're kind of experimenting as we go. And by the way, there are many of my Baptist brethren that think we had it right when we banned it and probably messed up when we brought it back. Who knows? But it is a changing document, not changing every year, not changing regularly, but changing as the need is put before us. Now, let me mention a couple of things. I believe also that the Constitution, as it is written and as it has been amended, is informed greatly by Rousseau, Locke, and those thinkers that believed in the concept of the social contract. The social contract being the idea that we have come together to form a government, and our government is enabled by the governed. We consent to it. And when we cease to consent to it, we change it. That is the essence of the social contract. I like that what Rousseau said. He said, "Man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains." Rousseau's an interesting fellow. Probably made that statement because he was imprisoned 5 times himself. So he sort of understood that the whole concept of a constitution and this whole concept of consent is sort of a moving target. I believe that the social contract informs our view, and through you see it throughout the Constitution, our view of 2 things that I wish to speak about briefly, and one is criminal justice, and the other is education. Rousseau believed that education was, or the lack of education was an imprisonment in itself. That ignorance was a form of incarceration, if you will. And that I have written about incarceration and education, and, if you will, liberty to some extent. That's become my area of research. But because I believe that liberty, which is the essence of the Constitution and our consented to government, is empowered by education. In this country, we have about 3.5 million people incarcerated. About 3.5 million people in state, federal, and local facilities, jails, prisons, or whatever. We have a lot more that are entangled with the system on probation, parole, or have been on probation and parole, and they come into a broader category of offenders, ex-offenders. We refer to them sometimes as convicts and others. And all of those people, in one level or the other, lack freedom. They lack civil liberties. I find it interesting that when we passed the 13th Amendment, the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery very specifically, and we'd gone through a great upheaval and conflict in this country to get to that point. But the 13th Amendment, although at one point it says, slavery and involuntary servitude shall not be allowed. But then we put in what I call the great exception. The great exception is unless you have been convicted of a crime. We allow, in essence, and many people have varying opinions on this, but we allow servitude, involuntary servitude, i.e. slavery, for those people who have been convicted. Now, some states, for instance, Florida, went through this state constitutional process of allowing convicted felons to vote, and it's a very cumbersome process. And immediately the state began, once the people allowed it by ratification of the constitutional amendment, the state legislature immediately began to try to blunt that. We're really not, the evidence was that they really weren't interested in these guys getting back into the system, being reincorporated, if you will, into society. And that's a real problem with, throughout. If you are a felon, an ex-offender, one of the things that you battle against is trying to get back into society. I teach and manage our prison program, and I teach in our prisons. And what I find is that there is no greater motivation for people who are in prison than the idea that they might be released and get to go back to their community, maybe reunite with their family and all of those things. But the obstacles are immense. And one of the greatest obstacles is not allowing to be included. They're not included. They're not included in very often. By you can't find employment. You can't find housing. But more than anything else, society, by law, by statute, often says that we really don't think that you should be a part of society by voting, holding a license, holding any sort of certification. You are prevented from that. People argue on various sides, on both sides. Various people argue that, well, you do that for protection. A major conservative organization believes that, well, people have to prove themselves in order to be able to vote or to participate, but they never outline what proving themselves is. Hence the term Sisyphus. We all know the story of the Greek king Sisyphus, who was charged with, he offended the gods, and his punishment for all eternity was to roll a boulder up a hill. And once he got the boulder to the top, after great effort and great exertion and a lot of pain, the boulder always broke away and rolled back down to the bottom of the hill. So he started over. And we sort of put that model in place in many ways for offenders. They struggle, they make their mistakes, they serve their time, they come back into society struggling to survive. They run into the obstacles, and very often they become recidivists because the obstacles are too great for them to overcome. I believe the social contract in informing the Constitution would say that we have a responsibility, we have an obligation not to put an obstacle in place, but to help these people become citizens again, to reintegrate into society. And it's difficult. That's tough. Now, being a recovering politician, I can tell you, there's no better applause line in a group meeting than saying, "I'm going to get tough on crime," or it used to be that way. I've heard it said in meetings that, where our prisons are overcrowded. Well, the solution to that is we've got too many people on death row. Throw the switch. We can open up some beds there. That's such a harsh and ugly thing. Really, what our problem is that it goes along with the theory of criminal justice, is that you really have the amount of crime, the amount of inmates, incarcerations that you desire. You decide how many you're going to have. Society does. And how do we decide that? We decide by how many prison beds we're going to provide, how many requirements in law of no accommodations in sentences, and on and on and on. We do a lot of that. Unfortunately, to get tough on crime mentality in the nation, not just in Georgia, but in the nation, and Georgia is one of the more active in this area. But we turned prisons and prison beds and prison employment into an economic development tool, and many communities end up pressuring their legislators. Can we get a prison? We'd like to have those 100 jobs. And that sets in motion, other things. Not that I'm not necessarily against private prisons. I'm not saying it. Actually, I know some that do a really good job. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we use prisons and prison industry, I think, sometimes in an inappropriate way. these people, what we're doing to inmates, we're doing in all of our name. This is our responsibility. And under the concepts that I mentioned to you, we have an obligation to to do right. As one of my favorites of the founding fathers is James Madison, and I don't believe Madison gets enough credit for his contributions. One of he mentioned that government should be something that pursues justice, and he gave the image of a never-ending pursuit to do the right thing, and I think that's what we should do. He mentioned that government should be and is probably the greatest of all reflections on human nature. So you can take a look at our prisons and how we administer them and derive from that who we are as a people, as individuals. You can make conclusions there. Let me end with something here that I wanted you to be aware of. And it's not a call to action. This is just an observation. How do we manage to do the right thing, if you will? How do we end up doing that? And that kind of brings me back to Madison. He says, he said that all men having power should be distrusted to a certain degree. And he also said that the abridgment of freedom of the people is more likely to occur by gradual and silent encroachment, not by an upheaval or a revolution. So what he's saying there, I think, to us as citizens today, our obligation is to pay attention. Well, first of all, certainly vote. We've got the opportunity. We should go vote. I'm amazed at a number of my students when they tell me, and I don't make this an issue, but so many of them tell me that they just never bothered to register to vote. And why? Not that they're afraid or anything. They just never thought about it. It just wasn't high on my list of priorities. So I think we have an obligation as a citizenry to be more involved. Two final statements, and I'll conclude, and I'll answer questions. And reflecting on what Madison said when he said that people with power, you should pay attention. Distrust them enough to verify, and that it's an ongoing thing. It's not something you do once and forget about it. There's a book review or a story written by Flannery O'Connor that I like. It's called "A Good Man Is Hard to Find." You probably remember that. Flannery O'Connor had Andalusia farm right up in Milledgeville, not far from us. And this story unfolds, and this very unpleasant, selfish grandmother, basically they fall into the clutches of some bad men, and the bad men are going to kill them. And so the grandmother selfishly tries to save her own life and starts being really nice and cooperative with the bad men. So one of the bad men says, I hate to kill her. She's a good woman. And the other misfit, as he's called, says this. He said, well, yes, she would have been a good woman, the misfit said, if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. In other words, she's behaving well because she feels the pressure. A guy I used to work for used this example in business. He said, there's nothing better for good business than the owner's footsteps in the hallway. Same thing with government. If we own government, as we claim we do, and as the Constitution intended, we consent to it. It belongs to us. What we do is on us. And so if it's ours, we ought to be in the hallway. We ought to be close. We ought to pay attention. We ought to know what's going on. And that would make for so much better government. Again, having been a politician and having faced the ballot box a number of times, the thing you fear is that people won't vote for you. You know, it's an ego thing and or whatever. And if we're close and we are holding those people with whom we have entrusted a great deal of power, we're holding them accountable. It's better for all of us. It's better for them. They don't necessarily like it, but it's better for them too. So we should call, we should write, we should stay close, and we should more than anything else pay attention. Okay, that's my take on the Constitution, criminal justice, and education for today.
Thank you very much, Roger, for this insightful and incredibly helpful Constitution Day lecture. And we're now turn things over to our audience and friends and community to ask you questions. And you can ask a question via chat, and we'll convey these to Roger. And to give folks, we have a question from Dr. Vess, and I'm going to proceed with that question, Roger. Dr. Vess asks, and let me make sure I can see it clearly. What comments do you have about the fact that the majority of those incarcerated today are African Americans and or other minority populations?
I think it goes to what Madison said. Government's a reflection of who we are, and we have in our prisons people who were there, or the pressures that brought them there are really more economic than they are anything else. Poor people, well, do they commit more crimes? Yes, because they're several things. They're lacking some education. They're lacking some what we relate it to strain theory. They have no money. They see things they want that everyone else has, and it creates that strain. And sometimes they commit these crimes. It is not reflective of race or color. I believe it is more reflective of their economic status. Poverty and crime are closely related. So obviously to address that, education and all of those things that would lift people, bring them out of poverty, would probably do more to limit crime. It was Cesar Beccaria, who is known as the father of modern criminology, said that very thing. He said that if you really want to eliminate crime, the only way I know is by education. He said, but that's a difficult thing to accomplish. As a matter of fact, it's a barren spot that is cultivated by only a few wise men and women. So I think education leading to better economic conditions would probably lead to fewer people in prison, and certainly fewer poor people in prison.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Dr. Vess. And now a question for Dr. Strickland. Have you seen or believe that there is a bias in the criminal justice system?
Well, certainly. But why? Why is there a bias? Because it is populated by biased people. And again, Madison said that, people, if you're going to form a government, it's going to be populated by men, and men have flaws. So yes, there is always pressure to favor one or the other. We see cases in the press every day where someone sought to protect someone else and use power illegitimately to do that. I've seen poor people go into court, and I actually heard a judge tell a young African American man once, who was incarcerated, he was being held in the jail. I, Your Honor, I don't have an attorney. And she told him, it is not my problem that you don't have an attorney. Um, and to me, I think it's all of our problem. Representation. So yeah, there is bias. We're probably miles, maybe light years ahead of where we used to be, but there's still bias in the system, and the only remedy for that is constant vigilance.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Brittany. The next question comes from Dr. Howell. What is your take on those who say the Constitution is set in stone, especially in regards to the Second Amendment and gun ownership? Yet they leave out the well-regulated militia part and forget the fact that the Constitution has been amended many times. They also forget the original arms were single-shot muskets. Is it possible to own weapons and yet have regulations and thus keep the heart of the Second Amendment?
Well, it's a good question, and probably the Second Amendment is maybe the First Amendment, but those two get kicked around a lot, and maybe I think abused. Obviously, we have restrictions now. I mean, if you really if you really believe that there should be no restrictions on your ability to possess arms, why don't you have a Stinger missile, or why don't you have a flamethrower, or whatever, those we certainly limit within reason. Every one of the 10 of the liberties enshrined in the Bill of Rights, which basically says what the government can't do to take them away. But all of those things that are in there have limits. Each one of them. Speech has limits. Assembly has limits. There are exceptions to everything. Now, I'm a believer in the right to possess a firearm, or firearms for that matter, but I reject the idea that right or privilege is unlimited, because we already limit it now. The question seems to be right now, should we limit it more? The argument certainly is that we certainly have more gun crimes than anyone else in the world. So, but yeah, no, you have to read the whole document in context. That's why I'm glad we have a Supreme Court, so that they can actually interpret this thing. Probably a good thing that we appoint them for life, because they have to do some things that are very unpopular sometimes.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Jeff. We don't have a question on the queue now, so I'm going to read from Sisyphus No More, Roger's really groundbreaking book, I think, and I just read a quote from it, really kind of a follow-up to, I think, the very good questions that Deborah asked and that Brittany asked, and Jeff as well. This is a quote from Sisyphus No More about the situation that we're in. Nearly 1.5 million individuals are living behind the razor wire. It's an enormous sum. And as if the figure itself was not disconcerting enough, it becomes even more so when we realize that in 1978, just a little over 40 years ago, the number of state and federal prisoners sentenced to over 1 year of incarceration was under 300,000, about a fifth of today's prison population. Roger, how do we get into this predicament? And how does education help us get out of it?
Well, we got into, and I think that when you add the jails into, I think I used the number 3.5 million, which is a kind of a common interpretation when you add the jails and the county work camps and all of those other things. But the number of sentenced state and federal prisoners went through the roof, really beginning in the 70s, but really took off in the 80s and the 90s when we said we're going to get tough on crime. We'll make war on drugs, and it's awfully and we have different. You talk about bias. We have different regulations depending on which drug, illegal drug you use. But uh, and it was very easy. And I was in office at that time, as I said. It's very easy to sell that idea. We're going to lock people up. People that are behind the razor wire are never seen, so they're out of sight, and people like that. We'll just lock them up, send them, and usually it's somebody else's family member. Yeah, but we've gotten so many now that it's your brother-in-law, it's your nephew, maybe your uh, mother. So we're seeing more and more of that. So that's how we got into it, and then the localities got involved because there's, you're going to spend $30,000 a year on an average, 33, I think it's the average, to keep somebody locked up. Somebody's selling those services. They're providing the things that require, that $33,000 takes up. So there's a lobby to, for incarceration. Lock more people up, and that means we'll build more prisons. And every one of my counties at one time or the other, and I had a total of 7 that I represented. Every one of them at one time or the other approached me about helping them get a prison, work camp, detention facility, or something, because they see the economics of it. It's a good business for them, and so the pressure builds. Now, how do we get out of it with education? One is that we value it, we understand where we are, and we educate not only the inmates so that they are able to choose a life that doesn't involve crime, or they don't get lured into crime. That's one thing. The other thing is we have to educate you and I. We have to understand that, first of all, this is being done in our name. I'm locking these people up myself, so to speak. And the judges and the communities have to look at it. This is that incarceration isn't something that we can do wholesale and sustain it. It is unsustainable. We've reached that point, really. The billions of dollars we're spending are really not sustainable. So we have to prepare people to do better when they get out, and then we have to prepare ourselves to see it differently than I use the example, and I'm not picking on Joe Arpaio in Arizona, but his model is totally, you did bad, so I'll make you miserable, and I will make you walk around in a pink jumpsuit to humiliate you, and sleep in a tent and eat cold food or whatever else I can get away with, and think that you're going to exit and you're suddenly going to see the light. Nobody wanted to go to prison in the first place. They weren't looking for it as a good location. It's not a destination they were seeking. They got there through a series of bad mistakes. So what you do is you empower them to make better choices.
Thank you, Roger. Next question is from Dr. Howell. What is your take on the legalization of substances such as marijuana? Would that not lower the amount of incarcerated people?
Y'all are determined to get me kicked out of the Baptist church before I leave here today. Let me just say this, not having been involved in that process much, but I will say this. I know the forces at work. We have over-criminalized some substances, and we sort of looked the other way at others. And I think I th so many people that I know that are in prison that we deal with, they are there for some prosecution for a drug crime. Now, is that, if you're a repeat offender and you're selling drugs to your community, maybe. But I think a better option would be treatment and diversion rather than. And sometimes, let me just say this: sometimes we don't deliberately encourage it. But let me give you a scenario that I have dealt with. I have someone who he couldn't wait. He can't to get his release. His what we call the temporary parole month, and he left to go back into the world. Well, he's on parole. And what he finds after his enthusiasm wanes a bit, what he finds is he's got all these obstacles before him. One obstacle is he'd hoped to come back into his community. Well, the community is not as excited to have him back. Not polite society, let's say. Wanted to find a job, and he finds that quite difficult because when people realize he has a record, they end up just sort of, let's wait for someone else. It's a little better right now because the job market is so good. And so he's also has to go see this parole officer every month, check in with him. How you doing? Fine. You got any work? Well, I hadn't been able, but I've been putting in applications. Where you stand? Well, I couldn't, since I didn't have a job, I couldn't rent a place, but I'm living with my mama or whatever. Okay, well now you need to get that job, because you got fines to pay. Most people don't know it, but it costs a parolee $35 or so a month for the privilege to be on parole. You have to pay that to be on parole. So as the costs begin to add up, and he begins to be pressured more and more, eventually this conversation occurs. How's it going? Well, I still hadn't found a job. Look, I'm getting a lot of pressure from the judge. So you're either going to have to begin to pay these fines, pay your fees, or I'm going to have to take you back before the judge, and you know what they'll do. They'll revoke your parole and you'll go back to prison. So I've got to have, on this account, I need $100 by next Wednesday. And he is faced with a dilemma. And the dilemma is this: I can't get a job. I don't know where I can get a job. I don't know how I can, but you know what? I know how I can make $100 quick. And he begins to slide back into that. And then he eventually becomes a recidivist. He catches a new charge plus his parole violations. And so, and we see him again. He's a guest back at some facility again. So, and so we sort of perpetuate. We help people sometimes become recidivists. It's not that they don't want to do better most of the time. Now, some people do. Some people become institutionalized, I suppose, and they want to go back to prison, but not many at all. They want out. They want liberty. They want to be able to live their lives and put all of this behind them. I know this for a fact. We're approaching some graduation with some of our prison students, and one inmate told me, he's got his TPM, his parole month, and I said, that'll be just before we graduate. I think I could get permission for you to come back and go through graduation. And he said, I won't use the word he used, but he very candidly said that is not going to happen. I will not be back here. I never want to come back here, even for a good thing. All I want to do is go away and forget this place exists. So,
thank you, Roger. We have about 11 minutes left. We have 2 questions in the queue. If you'd like to ask a question via Zoom and are viewing this via Zoom, please use the chat function. You also, if you're watching this, a number of people are via YouTube, you can also ask a question via YouTube as well. Next question is from Professor Mansell. Roger, what percentage of prisons in Georgia are private? Is that number increasing or decreasing?
I don't know the exact percentage, but there are a number. It comes to mind right now. I know there's one over in Millen, there's one in Alamo, there's one in Nichols, there's a private federal prison in McRae, and then there are others scattered around the state. So I would say no more than 25% are private in Georgia, and that seems to be that is waning, not necessarily waning, but there isn't a lot of appetite to build new private prisons right now. That's probably because the federal government has said they're getting out of the private prison business. There are, and again, this sounds almost conflicting with what I've said on other things. Private prisons aren't necessarily bad. I think they have the potential to be bad. I mean, they're private businesses. They must make a profit. But generally speaking, when they're monitored correctly, they seem to do a fairly good job. It's not about maximizing profit at the inmate's expense that I've seen. But I would say the appetite for private prisons is definitely has leveled off, and the attraction for the state originally was that that's the state constitution says you have to pay for everything as you go, or either with bonds or whatever. This allowed the state basically to sign a contract with someone who would go out and build a facility, and then basically bill the state for so many so many bed spaces each year. Every time an inmate is housed there, they get to bill the state for them. Now, I will say this: that is one of the reasons, though, that there is a lobbying effort and some pressure on the legislature, because you got all those beds out there, and these guys want to recover their money, and so they're not on board necessarily with lesser sentences and shorter sentences or decriminalizing certain things. They're opposed to that.
Thank you, Roger. Next question comes from Dr. Simmons. What would it take to make education programs such as the Byrd College Prison Initiative in New York more common across the U.S.?
The Byrd College does and has done, for lack of a better term, the Lord's work when it comes to prison education. There was actually, I think, a 4-part series on NPR about it's called College in Prison, I think, and it was great. I recommend it, and I have a copy. I'll loan somebody if they need it. But what would make that happen? The reason Byrd was able to do it is that they just took it on and said, we're going to do it. And they took a lot of it out of their own budget. Because in '87, I think, the Congress said, we're not going to fund any more Pell Grants for prisoners. And that was during that Get Tough on Crime. We're not going to do it because we don't think that that's appropriate. It was very short-sighted and counterproductive. But Byrd continued to do it, and now Pell is back. There began with Pell experimental sites, of which Brewton-Parker became one, and then Pell with the current administration. Pell has become universal again. It's available again. You still have to apply for it and prove a good use and that sort of thing. And then you have to deal with the Department of Education in that they're very particular about how that money is spent. But that's the thing. It starts with, to answer the question, it starts with a will of the institution to say this is part of our constituency and we are going to serve these people. And then you find the funding, and it can be partially done by Pell, could be foundations assist. For instance, Brewton-Parker, our program, we're Pell eligible, but that's a small part of the overall cost of an education. And we needed books, and we found a foundation in Georgia that said, we'll buy some books for you. So long as the inmates get to keep them, we'll buy the books for this class. And we had an ethics class that we taught last semester. They bought all the books, and all of the inmates kept them. And so, that's what it takes. First of all, it takes a will. Then it takes, the work to go out and find the funding.
Roger, thank you. We're almost out of time. We have about 3 minutes left. And I'd just like to add our thanks to you, Roger, and thanks to everyone for their very thoughtful questions. And perhaps ask the final question and say that Roger's book really is a cheerful book, is the best way to describe it, I think. Having taught 27 years ago as part of Brewton-Parker's initial prison plan, I taught constitutional law, and I actually learned something from my students who were amazing. And I thought, what in the world am I doing with this assignment originally? But then I learned so much and had such positive interaction. What form should this education take, Roger, in terms of bringing it to actuality?
Well, you start with the greatest need. Obviously, there are a higher percentage of people in prison than exists in the world without a high school diploma. You start with them, and technical colleges generally do a fairly good job trying to help people get a high school credential. So you need to do that, but we'll say this: the demand for that is much greater than the ability to provide it, the resources to provide it. So that's the first thing, resources for that. And then probably the next thing is you need to teach them something that they can use when they get out. That's also diesel mechanics, animal husbandry. All of those things that you can teach within the confined space is useful as well. But I contend that higher education, a liberal arts education, is probably as beneficial to these people because it helps them think. The problem is so often is that these people are basically reactive. They haven't gotten to the point that they're able to make critical decisions, and so they make bad ones. So I think a higher education, and I will tell you this, Bard is one example. Another one is a group called Hudson Link in New York, and they did the same thing. They just started from scratch, and New York State embraced them. But what they have found is that their people, the recidivism rate, whereas in the real world it's above 50%. Among their students, their students that have gone through their higher ed programs, it drops to 5. I believe that higher ed, liberal arts, helps people. Now you have to be careful what you're not going to give a felon a teaching degree. It will be useless. You're not going to give a criminal justice degree. It's useless, but you can give them social science degrees so that they can do counseling for people maybe that have had similar issues, maybe that work in business, a management degree, anything like that. You can work with them to get that has a broad application that doesn't have a prohibition attached to it. Will work very well. And if we could do, as someone suggested, what Bard has done more universally, I think you'd see our recidivism rates plummet. And that's really where we all want to go.
Roger, thank you very much. That will be our last word of this Constitutional Day gathering. Our deep and profound thanks to Dr. Roger Byrd of Brewton-Parker College and to our college community for very thoughtful comments, very thoughtful engagement. Next year's Constitutional Day speaker will be Dr. Joe Forneri from Rochester Institute of Technology in New York, and the theme will be the free speech provisions in the U.S. Constitution and the role of free speech in a democracy. So that's next year's gathering. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Take care and have a great afternoon.